Good evening, everyone, or whatever time it is where you are. And I couldn't be happier to get to introduce you to Dr. Jim Ritchie Dunham. Jim is an extraordinary researcher, particularly around leadership and flourishing. And I am so excited that his current research is actually receiving responses from people in 125 countries. And he's had over 100,000 responses so far to his research in this area. So goodness me, are we with an expert. So Jim works at Boston College. He also works for Harvard University, and he runs his own institute called the Institute for Strategic Clarity. And actually, having got to know Jim a little bit, I can absolutely see why his organization is called the Institute for Strategic Clarity. Yeah, he's pretty extraordinary at strategy. So if you're stuck on what to do and how to clarify something, or you've got something really complex that you need simplifying, then definitely get in touch with Jim as soon as possible. As I said, he's still teaching at universities. Lots of universities around the world require his input, which is really exciting, and so many students are benefiting from Jim's great work. And so do look him up on LinkedIn and see what he's doing, follow him. He's the author of some absolutely brilliant books. I particularly loved Economics, and do read that. It's such a great way of re-understanding economics for one thing, but also the nature of agreements between people, which is so fundamental to flourishing, and beautifully written. So definitely read Economics. And I know that Jim's got a few more. He's also leading a group on the Global Flourishing Study, which is a collaboration between Harvard University and Baylor University. And I'm so excited to see what comes out of that, and thrilled that Jim is leading one of the teams, because we know they're in very good hands. And Jim also does leadership, so he is practicing leadership for flourishing. So Jim, we really couldn't be happier to have you with us, and thank you so much.
It is a deep pleasure as always, Katy, to be with you.
It's so kind. So Jim, we're going to dive straight in, and I'm just love to hear your thoughts on leadership for flourishing. What does it mean for you?
Excellent. One of the things that I see, and a lot of the studies have been done, and hearing a lot of folks talking over my career the last 30 years, a lot of people are really disengaged. They don't like what they're doing. And when I ask them why they do that, they say, well, because they have to, or that's just the way it is. And so we know from some of the big studies that, it's way over half of the people are not engaged or disengaged, and some even actively disengaged. And so then, having been in organizational strategy and leadership and systems modeling for the last 28 years, I'm thinking a lot about how do we make our organization stronger, starting to ask the question of why do we do something that everybody dislikes so much? And that led me to this question of, is it true that it's everybody? Because I also got, over the years, been invited to go meet with or study groups or work with groups or create groups that were really abundant and doing amazing things, and people love being part of, like our group, our community practice. And so it's a lot of fun. People are very productive and creative. So I said, we have these experiences of people doing really well and really enjoying things. And yet there's this whole story of a lot of people aren't. And so trying to figure that out why, and starting to come to maybe there's another way to think about how we look at our organizations. And maybe is it something in how we lead and how we organize that's driving a lot of this disengagement? Because it's not true that everybody is disengaged and everybody is doing very poorly. So then if it's not true, then it's not a fact of humanity that we have to be that way. And so then how could we do it different? And so we've been thinking a lot about and working and identifying groups, like you said, through our survey of, are there groups around the world who aren't doing this? And then starting to ask the question, which is a big one in the business school, in the School of Public Health and Public Administration, where I've been teaching and doing the research, is if there are groups who have figured this out, we should go see what they're doing. and figure out if, because they're living in the real world doing things, but they're having a completely different experience. And so that led to maybe the idea that flourishing, meaning, doing well or well-being or total well-being across financial, physical, mental, social, spiritual, could actually be something that leadership could influence for the downside and for the upside. And then the term that our group, our community practice with you has been calling it is leadership for flourishing, but that it's completely possible that there are lots of people around the world who have figured this out, and they've been figuring it out for decades. And for some reason, we're not paying attention to that as sort of the way we could do things. And maybe it's time that we do.
Absolutely. And what would be kind of your biggest piece of advice to someone listening to this and working in an organization? So yeah, what would you say to them knowing all this and having seen all this?
Perfect. So I think one of for me, the starting point is a simple question, relatively speaking, is that, are you achieving the results and having the experience that you know is available to you? Yeah. So I'm not asking whether you are going to be able to behave or perform like somebody else. That's not really the question but are you doing the best that you know you can, and that you know you can with this group? And so what that means is I walked in and I'm working with this group and I sit around saying, I think we're doing about as good as we can do. Not on some other people's perspective or some objective other sense, rather just our own relative. It says, we're doing about as good as we could do, or, I think we could do a lot better. The three of us working together, we're not working together as well. We're not bringing out all the gifts and whatnot that we could. And so it's that feeling of, are you really achieving what you could? And a second part of that question is, are you achieving what you know you should be? Mm-hmm. And here there is more of a should or normative element to it of, yes, we're working really hard. We're getting about as good as we can out of our group, mm-hmm. but our task is a different one. And we need to be performing and engaged at a whole different level than we are. So, we run a school system in our state, and only half of the kids are thriving. And that's just not good enough. And then the question is, then how much do you really care about actually achieving what you know is there to do? Yeah. And so if we can see that there's a gap between what we're doing now and the experience we're having and the results we're getting versus what I know we either are doing or need to do, what's available to us or what we have to be able to do, then he says, well, what's driving your inability to achieve that? Yeah. And what we start getting into is there's something in the way we interact. There's something in the way we see what we see is available to us, how we interact with each other, how we make decisions. Our values, something isn't supporting us in being able to achieve what we have to. And so there it's really simple, which leads to that next question of, he said, good, well then, do you think you know what you need to do to get there? Mm-hmm. And sometimes they do, but usually said, well, yeah, of course. Well, if you knew what to do, then you'd probably be doing it. Yes. But the fact is you're not achieving those results and you're not having that experience. So there might be something hidden in here in your agreements that's limiting you. And it's not difficult to explore that. So maybe you want to explore what are some of those agreements around how your system is actually your operating system, that's not allowing you to achieve the results that you know are within you or you must be able to achieve, and the experience you want to have. And so to summarize all that, we're setting up, is there a gap between what you know is available or you need to do, mm-hmm. and what you are doing and the experience you're having? And if there is, then how much do you care about that? Yep. How important is that to you? And are you willing to do something to make that shift? And then, there are efficient ways to start looking at what could create that shift and what does that next level look like? Yeah. Possible. Because I think most people, I keep saying I'll finish that, but to finish that is, most people I think end up believing, well, we're doing the best we can and it's not possible to do different. Mm-hmm. And that's when we can start saying, yeah, but there are other levels and there are people who are living at that other level. So it is possible. And it doesn't mean you have to be a super person. It might be something as simple as just working different. Yeah. And I love, Jen, that you talked about agreements. And could you possibly expand on that for us so that we can,
yeah, kind of put that into part of closing the gap between kind of what's possible and what's happening.
Excellent. So the agreements has sort of two pieces to it, or why we use that term is because one, we found in a lot of cultures, a lot of people say it's just an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And if we recognize that it's just an agreement, then we can change the agreement.
Yes.
You say, well, what is the agreement? So it's not a law of physics that it has to be this way. And the way that we get into that is to start saying, is it always true in that group? Or is it true in all of your experiences that people don't see you and don't appreciate you? You
Yeah.
said, no, I have experiences in with friendships or other places where they do. I said, so it's not given. So it's just an agreement. And that's a term that we found in many cultures is it's just an agreement. So then I can agree to something else. So I'm negotiating with reality. The other part is the word agreement and its foundations comes from is an accord is another word that we use. And so it's a connection. So it's an interaction. And the word literally means an interaction between two or more nodes. Mm-hmm. So then it says, so what we're doing determines the information that flows in the interaction that we're having. So instead of saying information that flows in the interaction that determines behavior, we call an agreement.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so say if you were a teacher and you were running a department, say like a maths department or something like that, what would you advise that head of department to do to try and close that gap and maybe switch the agreements to agreements that were leading to more flourishing for that department? What advice would you give?
Excellent. So we technically, and in the book, we call it an agile vibrancy move. Just a term that we use to say you're changing from one level of agreements to another.
Yeah.
We use agile like they do in software to say, go try something and then get the feedback, see what happens and adjust instead of like one big massive plan. But basically what we would say in that case is start with that first question of, are you achieving what you know is available? Not what some other department did.
Yeah.
But are you achieving what you know is yours to do and what you think is available to you? And if they're not, then say, well, what do you think you should be doing? And so that first step is really asking, is there a gap between where you are and where you need to be or you think you could be? Mm-hmm. The second thing is then to start, the second part is then to start saying, well, what does life look like at that next level?
Yeah.
And what we know now from a lot of our data, the research, and it turns out a lot of people have been thinking about this for a long time, is these levels are qualitatively different. So they're different in kind, not just in degree. And so, for example, if you're very outcomes focused and very just do your job description and we don't do any of the adjusting, we don't think about, well, what did we learn today and how can we adjust? Mm-hmm. But then that next whole level is much more about learning and adjusting and bringing in different insights and sharing. And so for some people that could be very vulnerable. But the point is, you start saying, if that next level that you're looking for, we can start to ask, well, what does life look like in groups who achieve those kinds of outcomes?
Yeah.
And what we start to discover in the second step is they said, well, let's go see what they do that's different than what we do. Mm-hmm. And that's important for two reasons for that teacher or that math director department director is to say, I could come up with all kinds of things that I think you should do, mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that you'd be able to implement them. And we find that for two reasons, generally speaking. One, because they're already doing it, and like that's sort of obvious, and we've already done that. Or second, I don't really understand what you said.
Yes.
I'll say, oh yeah, sure, inquiry. So then I go tell everybody, you need to listen to me.
Yeah.
So, that's not what inquiry means, right? And the act of humility in doing that. So do you even know what that means? So when we go to visit groups or understand what is it these other groups are doing, one of the things that we find that maths director would be able to do is to say, well, I noticed this in what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And what we found psychologically is if you can see it in somebody else, it's because you also have that nascent in you.
Great.
And so then that's something that you could go try. He said, yes, that's different than what you do. And maybe you could go try that. So then the third step is, well, then now what you've seen a group that's performing or doing the kinds of things that you're interested in, maybe learning more or evolving their pedagogy or more collaborative and inclusive. and say, well, let's go back and look at your own agreements. He said, yeah, well, we don't do that. We don't do that. We don't do that. And it said, so how important for you is it to close that gap? And are you willing to go try some things to start seeing if they can start moving you in? So it's not a wholesale change of the agreements. We find that that doesn't work very well, to say ever. But you can start testing and saying, well, we're going to try this thing, such as we're going to try doing a check-in in the morning at our meeting. And we're just going to spend 5 minutes, say, tell me something new. Or we're going to get mentors, and we're going to actually listen to our mentors and engage them.
Yeah.
You know, but let's try a practice that we noticed in that behavior and then see what feedback we get on whether that works or not. So then it reinforces the capacity to do that. And so those 4 steps are, you know, is there a gap between what you're doing now and the experience you're having and the outcomes you're achieving and what you know you need to be doing or could be doing? What does life look like at that next level? Because if you did know that, then you'd be doing it, and you're not.
Yes.
That next level is qualitatively different, meaning it's different in kind, not just in degree. So then what does life look like there? What do I see? What do I notice that I could try that is different than what we're doing? And then go try it and get the feedback. And then once you see that and start adjusting, then you can say, well, what else could we try?
Yeah.
And then what else could we try? But now you're getting feedback and some momentum and moving and shifting and getting the practice of saying, well, it's just an agreement. We don't like the behavior we're seeing. We don't like the experience we're having, and it's ours. And so we could try something new. And it seems to work.
Well, that opens a huge amount of potential and possibility, doesn't it? If you look at it through that lens, and a real opportunity, and also by breaking it down just into small steps. So, oh, I noticed this, I'm going to try it, or we noticed that, and we're willing to try it. It makes it very kind of achievable and realistic as well, and not intimidating, because sometimes leadership can sound terrifying and sounds, you know, you might, if things aren't going quite right, you might be tempted to throw everything else and, you know, just try and do something completely different. But actually, what it sounds like what you're recommending is go see somewhere where it is working and just take a few things that resonate with you that are probably therefore nascent within you, and then you can try those and implement them.
Exactly. And one of the nice things that seems to be, I want to clarify that there are a lot of agreements that people exist in that are dangerous to change. So we're not saying to take on everything and go step into the most dangerous things. Please do be careful with that. But there are many of the agreements that we're in that aren't working, that if we just ask other people, if we feel safe and we can do that, just ask another teammate, even if you're not the leader, said, is this working for you?
Yeah.
And he said, like that mass director, I said, you know, is this working for you guys? He said, not really. And we found rarely that everybody says, oh, it's really working, when one person doesn't think it is.
Yeah.
And so if we can start to say, if we can open that up and say, well, then let's try something, because we also have experiences that are more abundant, more engaging. So could we try to do that? Because this just isn't working. But do you agree? So then you can open that space in some agreements and to say, if none of us like it, and we all believe we could do better, and we have experiences where we could, why don't we go try some of that stuff? Because we'd rather enjoy our work and be, you know, engaged and contribute with our work than doing what we're doing. So
definitely. Yeah, it's huge, isn't it? Because like the opportunity to enjoy work and be engaged in work, because you spend so much time at work. Therefore, if there is something that you could try, I'd love for you to expand what are dangerous things to be tinkering with and changing.
Right. So people also work in places or in groups where if they're to question these things, then there are very severe penalties.
Yeah.
Right? So people do have bosses that are really awful. One of the recent Gallup studies said, I don't remember what the number was, but it was way over 50% of people asked the moments that they hated most in their week was when they had to spend time with their manager. So that's like the worst moment of their day.
Yeah.
Right? That's really unfortunate. So in those circumstances, if you're working and you have to be doing this and your family depends on it, and somebody's gonna be very mean to you or nasty, then getting vulnerable might not be the safest thing to do. Trying to renegotiate with somebody who's pulled a knife on you
Uh-huh.
There are people who are skilled and can do that. But it's not like, oh, well, now I'm just going to go do that with everything. He said that might not be, or if you're in an abusive situation,
Hmm.
I mean, it can be a physically or sexually abusive situation. That's a whole different game.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that at work. The bully, the whole boss, all that work that's
Hmm.
being done. And so those are places where being vulnerable isn't safe.
Yeah.
What we found then is people, when they start recognizing it, says, maybe I need to not be in that situation. Maybe I can move to a different situation because I don't want to continue to live that way. And we know what that does to your physical health, your mental health, your social health, all those other things when you are making that kind of sacrifice
Hmm.
or compensating for, accepting that in your life, and you're not making the contribution. So that's what I mean by a dangerous of you can't be vulnerable without getting severely hurt. But then, what those groups tend to do is, can you put yourself in a different situation?
Yeah.
Don't stay in that context. But that's also easy for many of us to say. But some of the systemic gender issues or racism or a lot of those things, it said, all right, this is not safe to be able to do that.
Hmm.
But but the point in that is that's rarely, I'd say almost never, all of your agreements. Right?
Yes.
It's not all of your groups. So in those, maybe you don't question that for now, but you can start working with your agreements in other areas. And that's sort of the big exciting thing, Katy, is to realize, wow, there are all these things in my life that I'm not designing.
Yes.
I've accepted all kinds of other people's choices.
Hmm.
And I didn't even know that there were agreements that I could choose in here. And to start seeing, how can I be designing my life towards something that's more aligned with who I am and my contribution. And making steps to that, to showing myself that that's true. I can make different choices. And that's something that came out of sociology, a lot of research on. Most of these agreements are deeply embedded. And we
Yes.
have no clue that they're happening.
Hmm.
But once we start to become aware of them and say, well, wait a second, I don't agree to that.
Yeah.
But I didn't even know that I had accepted that.
Yeah.
So we think of those as unconsciously accepting agreements versus consciously choosing agreements. And then
Yeah.
where is it safe to start?
Yeah,
So
I love that. It's such a great question. Where is it safe to start? Because, like you say, your boss definitely does have a massive influence on your flourishing and your well-being. And really interesting McKinsey report, which I know that the Oxford Wellbeing Research Centre contributed to, actually demonstrated that your immediate line manager is the most important factor actually in your well-being at work, and your well-being at work is a significant contributor to your well-being overall. So actually it really, really matters, which I guess is probably why we kind of bound out of bed every morning, desperate to try and help leaders to enable more flourishing and to build better agreements, because we know that it matters so much for people's lives. But the really great thing is that, and what I love that you're saying, is that actually we've got agreements all around us. And so look at the colleague to the left of you, look at the colleague to the right of you, look at the colleague across in the other department who you could, go for lunch with, or take a walk with, or collaborate on some really cool project with. And actually you can find agreements all around you. And you can, like you say, if the toxic boss is going to be dangerous to deal with, which is quite possible, because things like we know that psychopaths are overrepresented in CEOs for the population. We see a lot of overrepresentation of narcissism of people in leadership positions. And these kind of things are very difficult to work with. So you need quite a lot of self-compassion where you can't change an agreement with a boss, because that can feel like you're kind of letting the rest of your team down, you're letting your colleagues down, you're letting yourself down. But actually, what you're saying is empower yourself, look around, look at the agreements you're making, make them consciously, and find the ones that are safe to change and that are safe to work through. So I think that's a really, really encouraging message.
I love that, Katy. I think what we observe is, if you can start doing as you just described, and starting to see the power that you have in those choices that you can make, and then getting to have the experience. It's not just an idea, it's not a theory, but to go try it, then it can also start to shift how you are in those agreements that you don't like.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I think it's that I can see that this is what you think is happening. And so, but I can put myself in that situation so that it doesn't do the damage, because now I'm consciously choosing it. And I can be in this situation. You can talk to me that way, but it doesn't have the impact because I'm aware of that now and I'm conscious of it. And that can come because I'm building that strength in other areas of my life or in other teams. And so then it also can weaken the impact in many cases of those kinds of leaders.
Yeah, which is definitely what we want. Because once you start to weaken the impact on you, that that can actually spread through an organization, because a kind of a culture of confidence, a culture of empowerment starts to spring up as people look after each other, and the influence and the impacts, the negative impacts of a toxic boss actually reduces through that. So again, I think that's very encouraging for people to know and think about, that taking this step to consciously think about the agreements that they're making and where they can make a difference safely is actually going to empower them and actually make a difference to the agreements that they can't make a difference to. So I think that's a really great message for everyone. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And it's sort of a basic part of the movement of freedom, right? The freedom to be myself and my creative contribution. And what we're highlighting is that there's a choice in there.
Yes.
And there are actually a few choices, not millions, but there are a few choices. And my awareness of the choice and which choice I'm agreeing to make, and maybe with others, changes everything. And unconsciously accepting them just means that somebody else is using my will.
Yes.
Versus, there's a future for the love of which I give my will. And if I'm not consciously choosing that, somebody else is.
Yes.
And you say, okay, no, I'm actually agreeing to do this, and that changes everything. Yeah.
Definitely. And we know from a lot of the psychological models of well-being how important autonomy and freedom are. Sute and Dina's model of psychological well-being really emphasizes autonomy as being really crucial. But actually we have, if you look at self-efficacy, we have probably more control than we think we do, particularly when we take the lens that you're suggesting and actually see where and appreciate where we have control and actually start to use that freedom for the benefit of not only ourselves but those around us as well. So yeah, again, really positive message.
That's great. Yeah. And powerful.
And I guess that leads us on actually to, you're talking about the future that you love, and I wonder whether that has anything to do with big yeses.
It does. That's great. So in the last year or so, and we got to talk together with Matt Lee at a gathering a while back on the big yes. And so what we started to see were two things I thought were kind of interesting. One, when asking people, do you know what your calling is? Do you know what your purpose in life is? Do you know what you're here to serve? Do you know what your uniqueness is or your creativity? And finding different ways of entering based on different professions or ways people think about things. But as to say, do you really kind of know what your thing is and what really gets you excited? And so a couple of colleagues in North Carolina were sort of saying, well, that's my big yes. I was like, I love that. And it's because it's my yes and it's not somebody else's yes, right? Now I can align my yes with you and your yes, and we can take on something together, but then it's my yes as a contribution to somebody else's. But what it also does, because we think of yes as a dichotomy, then it's a yes or no.
Yes.
Right. And so if it's not my yes, then maybe it's in my no. And then the question starts to come up, well, then why would I ever do anything that's in my no? And often we don't even realize, he said, wait, half of my day is in my no. Yeah. And why am I giving all my attention and energy to that when it's a no for me? And one of the things that came out of that's the second part that we started to observe, and now with the research and a lot of anecdotal evidence with all these communities we've been working with doing this, is basically a statement that whenever it's aligned with your yes, then the net value that's generated is positive.
Yes.
And so that means that the value that was generated, the value that was existing within the ecosystem or system that you're working in, there's more value afterwards when it's aligned with a yes.
Yes.
And when it's aligned with a no, the value is always less.
Yes.
And so it's net negative. And that means that there was more value extracted for the system than was generated by the system. And so there's a lot of technical work to that in the maths and the statistics to start working that out. But basically, you can think, I'm not in, and to unwrap that just a little bit is to say, when there's a big no, when it's, or just a little no, but he said, this is a no for me.
Yeah.
Then I don't agree with the purpose,
Yep.
which is the organizing principle for what we're doing in the first place. I don't remember and don't connect to the purpose because it's not mine. We're not really listening for the different people who need to make specific contributions to that, because we don't have a process for getting excited and engaging people because it's a no. We don't have an environment of trust that we're going to really share what we're seeing in the first place because we're not engaged and connected to it. And then our capacity to transform it and to give our best and learn and evolve and adapt isn't there because it's not in our excitement, it's not in our creativity. And usually when we see a no, we're also not engaging those that we're developing this for. We call that sort of transferring to. So we're just doing it, but we're not really including in a generative way the other community. So all of that says that, these people showed up with all these resources, but it was in their no, then most of that energy was lost. Most of that energy went to entropy. And so more value was extracted than was generated. But the flip side, when you look at this big yes, then I'm really aligned with the purpose. I really care about it. It's very easy for me to remain connected and as a group to stay connected to our purpose. And that brings in this massive amount of energy, brings in lots of insights, and we're trying to figure out ways to collaboratively bring in all these insights from different perspectives. And we tend to create these environments of trust so that we'll actually say, well, I think I see this. Well, then work it, help me see it.
Yeah.
And there's a vulnerability with that, but so we're connecting and bringing in a ton of energy that we weren't when it was a no. And then we have all kinds of structures and processes in place to be able to learn and adapt because we're excited about what we're serving. The point isn't to do it just efficiently. It's just that are we learning and adapting and figuring it out? And what are we doing for that? And then are the people that we're serving really here to support that? And what do they really need? So what product or service or experience are we developing? And so we're deeply engaged in them. So there's a lot, it looks like the results are always net positive. Even if we're unconsciously doing it and not aware that we're in this very big yes, but people are attracted to it. They're bringing resources to it. They're bringing excitement to it. The results seem to, even when we're unconscious of what we're doing, when we're in that big magnetic yes, the results are always net positive. And when we're in the not connected, people don't even know what the purpose of this is, then the cost of doing it far outstrip the benefits of doing it. So the result is net negative. So that's a bit of talking and framing around it, but the simple thing of, is this my big yes? And I know that because of what it feels like. And so it's just a very simple thing. Yes, people said, is this a yes for you? Like, and they said, that's a no.
Yeah.
Versus like, they start getting, oh my goodness, let me tell you about what's so exciting about this, and whatever it is, right? But then they go, oh yeah, no, this is mine.
Yeah.
But then that's a yes, and if it's not that, then maybe it's in your no.
Yes.
So then the big yes leading to net positive is just to say, and if you will actually give your attention to that, the net results are always positive. And if you accept your no, for whatever reason, just you have to be also okay with the net result will be negative. More value will be extracted than generated in that.
And what kind of practical advice would you give people who wanted to live more in their big yes than kind of, languish in their no?
Exactly. So I think first is to just start asking myself, do I have a yes? Do I know what I'm creative for, or I like doing, or I like being in service to? Do I notice who I like hanging out with because of the kinds of things that they're interested in? And are there things in my life that are no? So starting to make that distinction and awareness of there are things that are my yes, and there are things that are my no. And then starting to ask the question of, so I actually know that.
Mm-hmm.
And to ask myself, well, then how do I know that? What does that feel like in me
Yeah.
when I'm in that? And it said, so then, and what is the impact on my life of accepting this? So the no, we know, as you described earlier, leads to stress and all kinds of physical, emotional difficulties. And the yes liberates a lot of energy and the positive sides of those things. So then how are we okay with our no? And, or what is the percentage of yes and no? So the first step is just to become aware of that. And do I know what it is? And then I think second can be really useful is to then find somebody that you can talk to and get their feedback. Because what we find often is when somebody expresses something like, well, I got feedback from a doctor or a friend or something, or I just realized that this is sort of in my yes. And like we're the last person to realize that.
Yeah.
And I realized that you didn't know that you're really good at that. It said, or they said, this, this is a no for me. It said, every single time you talk about that, you all your energies goes.
Yeah.
Right? So finding somebody else who can be a mirror for you and reflect with you on what you think. You say, well, what do you think my yes is? What do you think my contribution is? And people have a lot of opinions, people that you trust, and can be vulnerable with it. So what do you see? And like, oh, and it's fun because often people say, I didn't know that about myself, or I hadn't seen it. But the second you point out, I go, oh, I really do like that. And you're right, that really just drains me. And
yeah,
I hadn't asked the question of why am I doing that? So I think the first big step to simplify all that was to notice and then to start asking myself, and then maybe ask somebody else that I trust, what do you see as my yes? What do you see as my no? What things engage me and energize me? And I could give my life to, and other things just drain me.
Yeah.
So
Amazing.
a nice way to sort of start stepping into where are those, and then what does that feel like, so that I can start to nuance that when I'm in different meetings or different gatherings or different, because then if I start to feel that in a group and say, wait a second, this isn't working. I might be able to ask somebody to my left or right, like you said, is it working for you? Because I think we could do better, because it's not only it's not working, but that sense is what we talked about earlier. There's a gap here between what I believe is available to us and what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so then that's sort of the big first step in making the difference, is acknowledging it for oneself. Yeah.
Definitely. And what about on an organizational level? So you want, say, a department level, or maybe across a whole school, or across a whole business, or maybe across a whole family. How can you kind of craft that and enable the business or the organization or the school to function in a big yes, kind of have an ecosystem of big yeses?
Excellent. So it starts with that same question of, are you doing the kinds of things and achieving the kinds of results and experiences that you know are yours to do?
Yeah.
And are you? And if not, why? And there are ways, a lot of different techniques for exploring that. But it's to start saying, we need to be able to do better. And then there's a lot of work but at all levels, not just leaders, to start saying, well, what could we do to start shifting our agreements? What is it about me that's causing this?
Yeah.
And that's a vulnerable spot for a lot of folks, but it also is a very powerful thing, because you can say, well, I can actually do something about that. And the result is more important to me than my ego around, not being able to say I need to learn something or do something different. And and a lot of that kind of stuff is also in your book of, if you want something different, then try something different.
Yeah.
But then you can start looking, like with that process we call the agile vibrancy move, is to say, what are the things that we can do that can shift how we work at the team level or across teams?
Yeah.
And then, we're also, then what can we measure to let us know how well that's going? So what kind of metrics or key performance indicators could we have to say we are learning? And one of the things that's exciting to me right now in our work is, can I start showing that this will actually lead to far better performance?
Yeah.
If you actually do this and you're operating out of a bigger yes, does it actually leads to better results. So it seems simple to say, well, it leads to net positive value
Yeah.
for everybody involved. He said, if we could prove that, then we have a much stronger argument for why we're doing this. But basically, it comes down to, look, our no is leading to all kinds of difficulties, and there are all kinds of things happening right now. In the United States, they're calling it the Great Resignation.
Yeah.
Lots of people leaving work because they just don't like the way it's working.
Yeah.
And so a difficult time in finding new people. And they're not entering into a lot of these older agreements and say, that is not going to work that way. And we also see that across generations, people saying we have different expectations.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that might, and people are talking about that is, are you aligned with purpose? Do you know what your purpose is? And are you aligned with that?
Yeah.
Do you know how to listen and engage people
Mm-hmm.
and be inclusive? And are you collaborative? And what does that mean? And are you including your customers and those things? But all of those are different elements of saying we actually choose to align with our yes.
Yeah.
And I think that comes down to basically for leaders is, what is the legacy that you want to leave behind?
Yeah.
Is the power that you have and the legacy because you were able to extract a bunch of energy from folks.
Yes.
And then, and then that's fine. They'll get the results that they get. But he said, if I'm actually wanting to leave behind a better organization, a better system, people grew under, within my leadership, and we're better as an organization because I was here, which I think a lot of people do want. Maybe not everybody, not all those narcissists that you were talking about, but I think a lot do, and they just don't know how. And so you can align your whole organization around this. This is what yes looks like for. This is our big purpose. This is why we need these different groups for their unique contributions.
Mm-hmm.
This is what an evolutionary process looks like, meaning we're going to go try some stuff and we're going to learn. And a lot of it's not that it didn't work. We got an opportunity to learn something.
Yes.
And then we're going to adjust. We're going to adjust with each other and figure this out, because it's far more interesting to go after the big purpose on the big goal than to prove that we were right in the past.
Yes.
And I think there are a lot of leaders who want that. I see that in a lot of my students now. They're like, that's just far more interesting than a power grab and showing that I have more, I have the power because of my position and you just have to do what I say.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not as interesting. It is for some folks, but not for a lot. So
I agree. I think we can take a huge amount of hope for future generations, what we're seeing, and the move towards wanting something that's much more of a contribution to the world and the people around you than just building up power for yourself. And the idea of kind of sharing power and power with rather than power over seems to be really growing in the younger generations, which I think is a huge cause for optimism. And you also see it in older people as well, as they come to the realization, as you say, that it's not that interesting just to tell someone what to do. It's much, much more interesting to understand them on a human level and what their big yes is and what agreements are going to enable them to flourish and, really, really contribute in the way they want to contribute to the organization, and therefore help the organization to flourish and, the community beyond that. So I think I have great cause for optimism. But as you say, Jim, I think a lot of leaders don't know how, and actually framing it around agreements, framing it around go and have a look, go and see, where's the gap, go see where people are doing what you'd like to have happen, and try some stuff out. It makes it much more achievable and realistic than like you're doing everything wrong, change everything, throw everything out. So, and yeah, it's really exciting. It's such a nice thought to be able to talk to each other about what our big yes is and what our unique contribution is to the world and how we can do that together, how we can go change the world together. So yeah, huge reason for optimism, I think.
I agree. And I think we start, and people look for things like in your book or the Global Social Leaders. They're coming and saying, hey, wait a second, I see an example of something I just didn't know.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we find, and I found this particularly powerful in some of the work we're doing in microfinance or in poverty alleviation. They said, for example, a woman I met in Peru online, in Zoom through one of our projects, and she was describing that she was going back to school. primary education. And she's probably in her 30s. And I go, well, that's really cool. And why? And she said, because I bought into the argument. I agreed that my daughter should stay in school.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of pressure in our community that she not stay in school, that she do other things. But I really thought it was important. So she did. And she looks a lot like me. And she was able to do it. And so I said, if she can do it, I can do it.
Yes.
And so that sense of dignity that comes from seeing another example, and it's not that they were able to do it because they're super special or super endowed with something. It said, wait a second. And that's sort of seeing the example in others, say, wait a second, I could do that.
Yeah.
And I actually know how to do that. And I really like that. I just had not connected the dots that I could do that.
Yeah.
And I could start to act that way. I could try that kind of exercise, or I could do that kind of offer to the world.
Yeah.
And then you see people aligning with that and saying, oh, well, I know how to swim, or I know how to cook, or I know how to teach. I'd like to try that.
Yeah.
And said, well, good. Well, then go try it.
Yes.
So I think exactly. I think the examples are really important for people to say, I had not seen that I had accepted something, but now that somebody else is showing me their light, now I can see into that. And I said, oh, I completely get that.
Yeah. Very exciting. Jim, that has been like the most incredible conversation. Thank you so much. Ideally, I'd like to speak to you for the next week or two continuously, and that would be just perfect. But we probably should wrap up. Jim, what kind of final thoughts would you like to leave everyone with?
Thank you. And thank you for this great conversation. I always enjoyed talking with you, and then sharing that there's a yes out there, and everybody has a yes. My belief about human beings is that we all have a yes. We all have something that we're really good at, or really passionate about, or care about, and want to be better at. And what we can do, sort of the message for me, is to take that insight and say, I actually know what that feels like.
Yeah.
I know when I'm aligned with that. And then so where and then what am I feeling like that? I'm saying, yes, this is my yes, and this isn't. I accept these agreements, and I don't want to accept these. And I didn't even see that I was. And so that allows us to start seeing choices. And so we can start to say, what am I unconsciously accepting?
Yep.
What am I consciously choosing? And to start to say, maybe I can shift that from all of these to one more on the consciously choosing. He said, I'm going to play with choosing this agreement.
Yeah.
And so, and we know what that feels like, and we can take this on. And so that leads to greater choice, which to me is significant, and those experiences. And for humanity, if we were all more aligned with our yeses, I think we'd get a lot better results. And then maybe the surveys 10 years from now won't be that most people are disengaged at work. Rather, a lot of people are aligning with their yes, and they know what it is, and they're supported in it. And I think that's fantastic. But that's the simple piece, is you know what that feels like, so try.
Yeah. You know what it feels like, so try it. And in 10 years' time, we'll have this conversation again, and there will have been a massive flip in numbers engaged in work and living their big yes.
Exactly. When people say, can you believe that 10 years ago, 70% of people didn't like working? Like, really? I'm glad it's not like that now.
Definitely. I can see it happening. A massive yes to that, Jim.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you so much. And yeah, really hope to get to speak to you more. Thank you so much, Jim.